So, welcome, Kevin. Thank you so much for coming along today. What an amazing way to start the week. I really appreciate your time here. So, for those who are not familiar with yourself or with your work, how would you introduce yourself?
Well, I am Kevin Aho. I'm a professor of philosophy at Florida Gulf Coast University. I've been here in Florida since 2004 at this university. And I'm also the chair of the Department of Communication and Philosophy at the university right now. I had kind of a convoluted journey through graduate school. I started out at the New School for Social Research in New York City, and then moved to University of Utah and Salt Lake City, and then finished up my PhD at the University of South Florida in Tampa, where I studied with a very important figure in existential philosophy, and especially Heidegger, a fellow named Charles Guillon, who sadly passed away this past summer, but had a long and influential career and taught a lot of students. And so that's the brief condensed version of who I am. And I consider myself a specialist in existential philosophy, phenomenology of the body, and areas of existential psychotherapy and phenomenological psychotherapy.
Now, phenomenology of the body is not something that I come across people saying a lot as their specialities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a booming field right now. It's largely indebted to the renewed interest in the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty
Mhm.
and some important and seminal feminist figures, obviously Simone de Beauvoir, one, and Iris Marion Young, another figure. And it's simply a recognition that the body is not something we have and that we're only contingently connected to. It's who we are. We are our bodies. We exist through our bodies. We live through the vehicle of our bodies. And so it's an attempt to undermine that classic Cartesian dualism that the human being is composed of two distinct substances, and an immaterial mind and a causally determined body. And phenomenology undoes that dualism in helpful ways.
So you spoke slightly about your kind of academic journey into this amazing field of philosophy and of existentialism.
Mhm.
But what drew you to want to specialize in existentialism in the first place? How did you stumble upon this particular?
Yeah, it's a good question. I came from a family of intellectuals. My father was a professor of sociology, but mostly kind of German social theory, and was raised, came of age during the counterculture revolution in the 60s and early 70s, when existentialism was all the rage and everyone was carrying around tattered copies of Camus and Sartre and Beauvoir. And my parents met in graduate school. And so I was surrounded by books growing up. And in my second semester of college, I was actually an engineering major in college, believe it or not. And the second semester of college, I read Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov during the winter break. And the book had a transformative impact on me. And it raised all of these deep existential questions about the meaning of life, the existence of God, the problems of nihilism, the experiences of anxiety in the face of death. And it awakened me to the fact that I've had these experiences. I feel this in my everyday life. And I changed my major to philosophy and never looked back. And many other aspects of philosophy I find uninteresting and boring, metaphysics and epistemology, even much of ethics, moral philosophy, I find boring and turgid. But existentialism always inspired me and shaped me, and it has stayed with me since I was 18 or 19 years old. And I had powerful experiences in my early adulthood and late adolescence of hanging out with my high school friends, getting high and having a few beers under the stars and talking about the meaning of life and what is it all about and who are we and why are we here. And I realized that those were the questions of the existentialists, right? Those are deep and important existential questions. And unfortunately, as we move into adulthood and find our way into careers and family life, we oftentimes lose touch with those important questions, and we kind of drift along in our existence until there's a crisis or a breakdown, and suddenly we wake up again to how important existential thinking is. And so that has kind of been the arc of my life. It's always been shaped and informed by an existential attitude or an existential orientation.
It sounds like you genuinely connected with the kind of existential questions and never were able to kind of shake them away, rather than stumbling across a textbook in a formalized module and saying, okay, I better learn this theory. Like, you
Yeah,
felt the questions
yeah,
within
exactly.
you. Yeah.
That was a visceral experience. It wasn't about a vocation. It wasn't about even getting a job as a philosophy professor. It was about a way of existing. And so I would be doing existentialism if I was managing a restaurant or working in middle management somewhere for a company. I would still be watching existential films, listening to existential music, reading existential poetry, and all of the things that move me, as you say, viscerally or in a mooded way, because they speak to the concerns at the core of our condition. These are the ultimate concerns of our lives, and so yeah, they've had a powerful orienting impact on me.
You bring up something for me, which is the fact that you're going through that phase of life when you're younger and you're chatting with your friends, and you're asking these massive questions, these really deep questions, and then you fade into a life where you're not supposed to be asking these questions. I remember, for me, I don't know about you, but it was kind of almost stigmatized to ask why rather
Mm.
than to just follow, to
Mhm.
to question these deep meanings rather than to just pick a career and follow it. I don't know if you can relate to that.
Oh, certainly I can. And it's, you know, just because we are kind of sucked into the shallows of social convention and go with the flow of everyday life, the existentialists make it clear that that's not a moral failing. It's not as if you're doing something wrong. It's just part of the inertia of being human, that we're always going to be. Heidegger has this language of temptation. We're tempted by the they or the public world because it's comfortable, it's predictable, it's well ordered, and it covers over the anxiety, that kind of quivering unease that all human beings experience, an unease that reminds us that there's something wrong with us, that there's something disconnected or out of sync with us and the world. And it's because we're conscious. It's because we're self-aware that we're aware that we're going to die. We're aware that God is dead and there are no moral absolutes. And so I think existentialists are just deeply attuned to the fragility and weakness of human beings, that we drift to religion, we drift to comfort, we drift to social norms because it shelters us and it protects us. It's not a bad thing. It's just it's structural to the human condition. But thankfully, in life, we have breakdown experiences where that comfortable facade collapses and we're forced to confront ourselves and face who we are. And that's why anxiety conditions, whether you call it anxiety if you're Kierkegaard, or nausea if you're Sartre, or absurdity if you're Camus, or the horror of the nothing if you're Nietzsche, all of these experiences are edifying experiences because they jolt us out of our routinized drift and force us to face ourselves and to face our existence. And so the existentialists do something counterintuitive, and that is they tell us that anxiety is a good thing. It's a teacher. It's not something that should be medicated necessarily. It's not something that should be controlled with cognitive behavioral therapy necessarily. That's not to say that those things shouldn't be included in a treatment plan, but we should listen and attend to those experiences because they're teaching us valuable lessons about who we are.
Because I always have heard that existentialism gets a bad rep for being too focused on the negative, too focused on the dark. But I, similarly to what you've just said, have never experienced like that. There's always been a sensation that it acknowledges and explores the darker side that is inevitably going to be there, whether you're facing it or not. And actually, if you're able to explore these different philosophies, these different perspectives on the dark, and really confront it and really explore what that means for you, you are empowering yourself in a way that nothing, no denial or no putting it to the side will ever do.
And that's one of the recurring misconceptions about existentialism, that it's a dark, brooding, navel-gazing philosophy. It's not at all. The idea is when you confront death and face death, you awaken to the fact that life is not a dress rehearsal, that this is the only life you have. And confronting finitude, facing anxiety, injects a measure of intensity and urgency and vitality into our existence that otherwise it wouldn't have. And this is why Nietzsche calls his philosophy a gay science. It's a happy philosophy. It's not a morbid philosophy. It's a joyful philosophy. And Kierkegaard will say the same thing, right? That when you confront death, it opens us up to how precious and poignant and fragile every moment is, because it can be snatched away from us at any time. And so in many ways, existentialism, at least for me, is the most life-affirming of all philosophies. It's not a death-focused philosophy at all. It's reminding us of how precious each moment is and that we can't take any day for granted.
Now, I jumped straight into existential philosophies and I'm not as familiar with other philosophies. So how would you distinguish between what differentiates existential philosophies from other philosophies?
Well, I mean, just in terms of academic specialties, in Anglo-American philosophy, existentialism is completely marginalized because it doesn't focus on the core issues of truth and knowledge and the nature of reality and what is the best, what is good conduct, what ought we to do. Existentialism doesn't care about any of that generally because the concern is not on philosophical abstractions. What is the nature of beauty, truth, justice, the good life? Well, actually, that's not true. They're concerned with the good life. The existentialist is concerned with what does it mean to be human? What is existence? And so what the existentialists do is they shift the philosophical orientation away from theoretical detachment, where we theorize about abstract forms, and turn our attention to the concrete flesh and blood particulars of everyday life, which is what existence engages or is involved in. And so it's a complete reversal of the traditional philosophical orientation that we inherit from Plato and Aristotle, and that gets refined and consolidated with figures like Descartes and Kant. It's not a a philosophy rooted in theoretical reflection. It's a philosophy rooted in attentiveness to the concreteness of our existence, of our being. And that means it focuses on the way we live every day, the moods we feel, the affective experiences that shape us and shock us into awareness, like those anxiety moods or nausea moods. And so it's always been a kind of peripheral fringe philosophy in the UK and the United States, obviously less so in the golden age of French philosophy and German philosophy in the 20s and 30s and teens. But thankfully, that's starting to change. And one of the drivers of this change is a recognition that because existentialism focuses on concrete existence, it can expand the philosophical perspective to include voices that have been traditionally marginalized in the philosophical mainstream. So feminist philosophy, of course, was in many ways inaugurated by Simone de Beauvoir. Critical race theory was deeply impacted by Frantz Fanon, who was a student of Sartre's and Beauvoir's and was influenced by Maurice Merleau-Ponty. And so these other forms of philosophical approach that have never had a voice at the table are finally being seen as bona fide philosophical perspectives that, in my view, are in many ways indebted to existentialism by focusing on the concrete and the particular instead of abstract universal forms or essences.
I know this is me speaking from a completely biased perspective, but hearing you say that, it makes me find it hard to imagine why other philosophies have the ability to matter if we haven't understood what it is to be ourselves. If we haven't understood the kind of existential aspect of existence, why does it matter what's right or wrong if we don't know what we are?
I totally agree. I mean, I find most of Anglophone philosophy quite boring and uninteresting because of that. And as a teacher, the classes that excite the students and engage the students and inspire the students are existentially themed courses, because they're at that stage in life where they're asking those questions. What am I doing? What is it about? Why am I majoring in this and not in that? And how is this going to shape the future of my life? And so when we start talking about Friedrich Nietzsche or Martin Heidegger or Jean-Paul Sartre, the students resonate to these questions because they're feeling them right now at age 18, 19, 20, 21. And they're going to have to confront those really serious concerns. They're not so passionate about abstract metaphysical speculation. Those are interesting and curious thought puzzles, but they're curious in the same way that I'm curious about getting good at chess or figuring out the New York Times crossword puzzle. Those thought experiments or philosophical curiosities don't keep me up at night. They don't wake me up at 3 a.m. where I'm jolted awake and I think, what's the meaning of my life? That's existentialism. You see, that's more important.
Yeah, there's a difference between intellectual fascination, intellectual curiosity, and kind of an inherent questioning that you're saying kind of innately surfaces at certain times of life, you're saying, and in certain experiences, for example, this really life-shattering or life-questioning experiences.
Yeah, exactly.
And we have been obviously discussing the phenomenon, but we have not been defining the phenomenon. If that is possible, how would you define it?
Well, existentialism as a technical term is almost beyond a clear definition, and it's an ism, as I write in my book, that really is misleading. It's not like rationalism or empiricism or scientism or naturalism. It doesn't refer to a unified philosophical school. And the word wasn't introduced until until the 1940s, right, by Gabriel Marcel. And Marcel used that word to refer to the philosophies of Sartre and Beauvoir. But existentialism as a word didn't exist in the 19th century. So Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, the word didn't even exist. But I think to get a sense of the overall contours of what the word refers to, it refers to a philosophical focus on what it means to be human. What does it mean for a human being to exist? And the idea is that we exist in a way that's fundamentally different from the way this water bottle exists or this cell phone exists. We are not substances. We're not static things that are objectively present to be studied. We are activities or processes or happenings. So existence is an event for humans. It's an event of self-making or self-fashioning. We make ourselves who we are through the meaning-giving choices that we undertake as our lives unfold. And this is what Sartre means when he says existence precedes essence, right? There is no pre-given essence that determines who we are. We make ourselves who we are by choices, by actions. And those actions are always constrained by our embodiment, our social historical situation, our gendered or sexual situation. So it's not as if our self-created, the activity of self-creation is completely unhinged. It's not completely undetermined. It's situated and constrained by what the existentialists call facticity, the facticity of who we are. And so what we do as humans is we are in a struggle or a tension between the givens of our situation and our capacity to interpret and give meaning to those givens. And the existentialists call that transcendence. So we're always in this tension between transcendence and facticity. And that struggle is existence itself, right? I'm giving meaning to the fact that I'm a man in the 21st century who's white and middle class and for the time being ambulatory and able-bodied. And I'm going to have to interpret and give meaning to that factical determination as it changes and shifts and is modified throughout the course of my life. And of course, what that means is that the process of self-making is finite, it's temporal, it comes to an end. In other words, we make ourselves who we are with the recognition that that process of self-making is finite, that we are beings on the way towards death. And we don't like that. That scares us. So oftentimes we live in a way that is in denial or flight from our own finitude, from our own mortality. And that's why most of our lives are inauthentic, or in the words of Sartre and Beauvoir, in bad faith. We live in a state of self-deception most of our lives. And we think in the course of our lives that there's something real and enduring and lasting about our existence. But the existentialists want to remind us that there is nothing real, enduring, or lasting about our existence. Our existence is finite. And that's not a bad thing. It's just part of what it means to be human, and we need to kind of own up to that. And so central to that process of authentic self-creation is a kind of honesty, that we need to be honest with ourselves and cut away all of the layers of self-deception that we carry with ourselves to protect us from the horror of our finitude, the horror of our contingency. So one of the things that the existentialists say is that, we exist, but we don't have to exist. There's no reason for us to exist. We just happen to be thrown into existence. And against the backdrop of our thrownness, we now have to make ourselves into who we are. And that's a huge burden. That's the burden of freedom, It's dizzying and anxiety provoking. And we don't like to accept that either. And that's why we like to be told what to do. We like our priest to tell us what to do, our therapist to tell us what to do, our pop psychologist to tell us how to live our lives. We don't want to do it on our own. And of course, what the existentialists want to say is, it doesn't matter. You're always on your own anyway, right? You've got to be honest with yourself. So that's the Cliff Notes version of existentialism. Hard to define, but there are kind of central features built into it: freedom, authenticity, temporality. All of these things kind of undergird all of the existentialist philosophers. The problem, unfortunately, is that some of the most significant voices in existentialism aren't philosophers at all. They're novelists like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. They're poets like Rainer Maria Rilke. They're filmmakers like Akira Kurosawa. They're playwrights like Sartre, and novelists like Beauvoir. And so existentialism expands far beyond the academic world. It's not exclusive to philosophers. It's open to anyone who's sincerely concerned about the human condition and is anxious about what it means to be human and is trying to articulate and express that anxiety or that concern. And there are also religious existentialists and atheistic existentialists, right? And so not all existentialists are following Nietzsche's maxim that God is dead. Many of the most important existentialists were theistic existentialists, like Dostoevsky, like Paul Tillich, like Martin Buber. And there are some existentialists that don't believe in free will, like Nietzsche. He thinks free will is a fiction, it's an illusion. But most existentialists have some conception of freedom, of free will. And so this is why it's so difficult to demarcate the boundaries of what existentialism is.
Yet there are these familiar names that are going to generally be coming across when you're studying it, especially from an academic point of view. And it's making me think, how did these particular names get selected and put into the textbooks, and why are they the ones kind of being regurgitated and shared? Not that there's anything not completely marvelous about what they're sharing and that they shouldn't be shared, but why them? Why not anyone else?
Because they're the ones that do it. They're the ones that engage the human condition in the most powerful and accessible and visceral way. And so other novelists may talk about the human condition in certain ways, but very few do it the way Dostoevsky does it in Crime and Punishment or in The Brothers Karamazov. Very few articulate the experience of confronting death like Tolstoy does in The Death of Ivan Ilyich. Very few capture the despair in the face of the dizzying abyss of existence like Soren Kierkegaard does in Sickness Unto Death. So these are the figures that engage the human condition in the most powerful way. But there are other marginal figures or figures on the periphery that do it in different ways. But in my view, they may not do it as well, or some may not have been discovered yet. Who knows? But when it comes to the major figures, they're major for a reason, because their legacy is enduring and lasting because they tend to do it better than anyone else.
And it being, they speak to that humanness within you, to that unspeakable part of you, which is just craving stimulation, craving questions, craving answers. And they allow this kind of internal communication with that being. And that's why they're...
Well, I don't know if it's craving stimulation or craving answers. I mean, one of the things that the existentialists will say is that craving for stimulation is actually a form of denial. We want to be stimulated and distracted from our human condition. And there are no answers to the human condition. what the existentialists want to do is put us in a state of questionability, that there is no answer to the question what it means to be human. You have to find that for yourself. You have to give your life meaning. So there are no, it is not as if the existentialist lays out a guidebook to being who you are. That's the scary part about existentialism. It's up to you to find out what this means. This is why Nietzsche, for instance, is so famous for cautioning his readers, don't become Nietzscheans. Don't follow me. Follow yourself. You need to carve out your existence and give meaning to your existence in the way that matters to you. Nietzsche did it for himself, but you're not Nietzsche. You have to do it in your own way. And Kierkegaard calls this subjective truth. It's a truth that no one else has access to. It's your truth. It belongs to you. And it's going to be incoherent and unintelligible to anyone else. And that's why it's precious to who you are. So one of the tricky things about existentialism as a philosophy, and actually this is kind of true to philosophy in general, answers aren't part of the project. The project is to immerse yourself in the questions, or as Rilke says, live the questions, exist the questions, and be comfortable in the mystery and the ambiguity of the human condition. The more we try to find reasons or grounds for our existence, the further away from authenticity we drift. Does that make sense?
And that is my observation of what is causing people the deepest pain, is when they are needing that answer to what ultimately can't be answered, because it is just life. It is just your decision. You wake up each day and either do the very much similar thing that you did yesterday, or you be a completely different version of yourself doing a completely different thing. That there is just infinite ambiguity if you're willing to experience it.
Yeah, and so I think one of the measures of authenticity or being true to ourselves is to learn how to be comfortable with, or to dwell in uncertainty, to dwell in mystery and ambiguity, and don't recoil from it, or don't try to control it and master it, but to immerse yourself in it. And that is the human condition. It is a fundamentally ambiguous and uncertain predicament. And the more we try to control it and manipulate it and master it, the more anxious we become. And this is why this is one of the key features of it in existential psychotherapy. The more you try to control your anxiety, the more your anxiety takes control of you. The more you befriend your anxiety and welcome your anxiety and dwell in it, the less control it has over you, the less power it has over you.
For someone that might be watching this and really sitting there struggling with their mental well-being or with their experience of life, and they were hoping that existential ideas might alleviate some of that, what would you recommend for them in terms of either just exploration or particular sources?
Well, it's hard for me to say because I'm not a clinician and I'm not a mental health counselor. And I think it's a case-by-case situation. I think one of the stereotypes of existentialism is that it's anti-psychiatry. And this is an orientation that was really pioneered by figures like Artie Lang, who was deeply inspired by existentialism and especially the work of Jean-Paul Sartre. And the idea is that any medical intervention that blunts or covers over our freedom or our confrontation with our condition is dehumanizing and problematic. I don't think that's true at all. I think some people need pharmaceutical assistance, medication. I think some people need instrumental psychotherapies like cognitive and behavioral therapy. And so my approach to this from a mental health perspective is very much an eclectic approach. You use what works. I think someone in the grips of full-blown panic and anxiety, Nietzsche's not going to help that person. Kierkegaard's not going to help that person. In fact, it could inflame the situation and amplify it. However, if the anxiety is controlled or mediated in some sense with an antidepressant or with some form of cognitive and behavioral therapy, that may allow that sufferer to begin the hard work of existential psychotherapy. And so I would certainly not employ existential psychotherapy as a first line of treatment in every situation by any means. But I think existential psychotherapy has to be employed for lasting change to occur, for lasting and significant transformation to happen and growth to happen. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of the way I would go about
it. Which could almost be summarized as saying work out on a kind of on an individual basis, on a unique basis, and also I would argue in unique to each moment, because so I do work as a practitioner, and I'm obviously highly influenced by existential philosophies in my work, but what I'm going to do with a client one day, or how we will be together in a session one day, is going to be fundamentally different perhaps than the previous week or the next week. Yeah. And I feel that's, from my perspective at least, there's something about having these philosophical ideas, having these concepts, having these key themes almost within myself as lenses or perspectives to have as an alternative way to look, and especially a lot of it's rooted in not being able to change, not being able to make a change.
Yeah. I think that's right. And I think one of the great insights of existentialism is the recognition that anxiety and despair are not medical conditions. Mm-hmm. They shouldn't be medicalized as discrete medical entities. They are structural to the human condition. They're inescapable. Everyone is going to have powerful and life-shattering anxiety moments. And most of us will have them over and over again throughout our lives as we go through a divorce, or our parents die, or we lose our job, or we suffer a serious illness. All of those experiences are going to shatter us, and we're going to have to confront ourselves. But to say that experience of existential shattering or anxiety in the face of our own finitude is a medical condition is really problematic in my view, because that doesn't mean they shouldn't be treated and assisted with pharmaceuticals or CBT or something like this. What the existentialists want to remind us is that these are instructive, edifying opportunities for personal growth and transformation, right? They're awakenings. And if we just blunt these awakenings with tranquilizers, or are trained to not attend to them and avoid them, you're never going to have those transformative opportunities that anxiety can bring to us.
Do you feel that there have been moments in your own life when this has applied?
Oh, God. Countless times in my life. Every major breakdown, every crisis, existentialism has helped me. 3 years ago, I had a massive heart attack while on a 60-mile bike ride, something I did regularly. I'm kind of a fitness advocate and health nut. And I had a massive heart attack, and my whole world collapsed. My identity as a professor, my identity as a physically fit middle-aged man, my identity as a partner, or in terms of my relationships, and existentialism helped me work through that trauma and come through the other side, I think, as a better human being, with a deeper perspective about life's frailty and precariousness, and woke me up to living with a sense of urgency and vitality and intensity that you inevitably get sucked away from in the drift of professional life or family obligations and work obligations and so on. So existentialism has throughout my life, from 18 years old on, numerous breakdowns, divorce, sicknesses, losses of friends to cancer and illness, has pulled me through and deepened my life and opened up opportunities for growth and transformation. And so it has been, whether it's through existential literature or reading Heidegger again or teaching Nietzsche and Jean-Paul Sartre in the classroom, it's always been therapeutic for me.
I appreciate you sharing, and I suppose because I'm socialized to think I'm almost instinctively, when you hear someone's experience of trauma, you want to instinctively say, I'm so sorry that you had that experience. But I'm learning more and more, and especially with you sharing this growth beyond and these new insights that you gain from it, there's almost a sense that, well, I'm not sorry that you had that experience. In a way, you're saying that it contributed beautifully to your life.
And that's actually the great gift of existential philosophy, is that these traumas and crises, I mean, you don't want to romanticize them. You don't want to romanticize suffering. And that's always a temptation in existential philosophy, that he or she who suffers the most is the deepest and the most authentic. That's just nonsense. And I don't think that's an accurate depiction of what the existentialists are trying to do. But the recognition that trauma and suffering and breakdowns awaken us to life's frailty and its poignancy, and remind us not to take our relationships for granted, or our day for granted, that it could be snuffed out at any time, are tremendously valuable life lessons. And they improve and enhance our lives. They don't diminish it at all. They make us, in my view, better people, more compassionate, more understanding, more sympathetic to the suffering of others. And so I think you're right, that cliche, I'm so sorry this happened, I'm so sorry for your loss. Those losses are opportunities for growth. Those deaths are opportunities for transformation. And Kierkegaard is great with this. I mean, Kierkegaard goes so far as to say, God wants you to die. God wants you to die to the world, because when you die to the world comes back to you in a way that's more vibrant and intense and urgent than it was before. So the idea is to die over and over throughout your life. And every time you die, the world comes back with more vibrancy, intensity, and poignancy. And during that process, you prepare for your actual death. In Rilke's words, you learn how to die, which is the most important lesson that a philosopher can teach. How can you learn how to die?
I'm aware that it could be really easy for someone to sit here and hear this and think, well, it's so easy for you guys to speak theoretically about embracing the opportunities that suffering provides. But hey, I'm sitting here with a real life experience of suffering, and I have no idea how to. How do we do that? Especially when we haven't had, the advantage of years of actual philosophical engagement.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. I mean, some people won't. Most people won't. Most people will live lives of deep suffering and meaninglessness. And that's just the part of the predicament of being human. Many people live sad, ordinary lives that are bereft of deep meaning and significance. Tolstoy says it great in the Death of Ivan Ilyich. He says, Ivan Ilyich lived an ordinary, simple life, and therefore it was a life that was most terrible. And that's the life that most of us will live. And this is why I think, Natalie, projects like the ones that you're doing, which are trying to give voice to the importance of existentialism, are so important. Education is important. Good liberal arts, humanities education is important. Reading great literature, watching good film, listening to good music. Those are all important, edifying experiences that speak to the human condition. insofar as those movies and pieces of literature and pieces of music speak to the human condition. And so, again, sadly, most of us are going to suffer and not have the wisdom that the existential tradition can open us up to. And one of the things that I do in my work is I try to popularize existentialism by writing about it and by giving talks on it and by going to conferences and being a Pied Piper to my students about how important these questions and ideas are. And so I try to incorporate that wisdom into everything that I do in my conversations with my friends, with my partner, with my colleagues, reminding them that this petty squabble about academic bureaucracy doesn't really matter. Don't get hung up on it, because you're going to die, and you're going to die at any time. And so put things in perspective. What really matters in the grand scheme of things? And Irvin Yalom, the great existential psychotherapist, refers to this as trivializing the trivial. Realize that these things that we worry about most of the time in our lives are trivial, stupid, wastes of time, that there are much bigger, more significant issues on the table, like living a meaningful life and being a decent human being.
And how generally does that go down for you when you're engaging with people who are living in the trivial, who are embracing the trivial conversations, and you're like, hold up, that is trivial. Let's talk about something deep.
You have to be. It's a really good question. I mean, you have to be careful, because it's not going to register for most people. I mean, most people are like, Kevin, he's so dramatic. I mean, he's such an intellectual. He's always talking about these heavy things. But if you're sensitive and mindful to the speaking position of other people, you can do it in ways that are thoughtful and sensitive. And so you don't want to bludgeon someone with existential philosophy and say, wake up, wake up. You can be thoughtful by asking questions like, what does that mean for you? Why is this worrying you? Why is this concerning to you? With my students, it's a little bit different. I can be a little bit more blunt, because I'm a teacher and they're learning this material. So I can shove it down their throats, whether they like it or not. But with my friends and my family and my colleagues, you have to be a little bit more indirect and thoughtful, and recognize that these ideas are quite scary and can be terrifying if you've never dipped your toe into existential philosophy before. And that most of our culture is built in such a way as to deny these concerns, right? That most of our cultural institutions are set up in a way that we don't have to face the existential givens, right? We don't have to face death. We don't have to face absurdity. We don't have to confront anxiety, and so you want to be cautious in terms of how you bring this up, but oftentimes it means that I just cut some people out of my life if they're not willing to engage. So I don't have a lot of friends maybe for that reason, but it's the same reason why I don't have friends who are Donald Trump supporters. There's no reason for me to waste my time with someone who is a dogmatic follower of Donald Trump. I have nothing really to say to them. In the same way that it'd be very hard for me to try to gently broach the idea that maybe God is an invention to someone who is deeply ensconced in a religious faith, and their identity hinges on the idea that God has to exist. It'd be very hard for me to disentangle that person from those deeply held convictions. I could suggest some literature, maybe some books, but it wouldn't be a conversation that I'd be interested in having.
I remember really early on in my training, one of the lecturers must have just supervised some students, because it was obviously quite fresh for her, but she was saying that they'd conducted their entire thesis on the potentially damaging and ending results that engaging in existential philosophy can have on interrelationships, be that with partners, intimate relationships, with friends, with family members, because we speak about, you spoke there about choosing to move away, but it almost becomes, and I've spoken with colleagues, it almost becomes intolerable not to think deeply, not to see things as trivial when they are trivial.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, and I don't want to be harsh about this, but it's okay to cut people out of your life that have no, that aren't bringing meaning and value to your existence. And with family members, it's much more difficult because there are long-standing connections of intimacy. But I don't have much problem disconnecting from friends that don't really see the relevance of these kinds of questions or concerns. And I also have a very hard time with small talk and gossip. It makes me very uncomfortable. So going to cocktail parties or where people are just talking about trivial things, that makes me quite anxious and unnerved, and I don't like that. But if a conversation at a party is involving real serious existential questions, I'll be there all night, and I'll be passionate about the conversation. And it, for me, it's a temperamental orientation. Temperamentally, I'm very uncomfortable with surface conversation. It makes me quite anxious. And it's the same thing at faculty meetings or department meetings. I'm a department chair, so I have to deal with a lot of bureaucracy and deal with upper administration. Those meetings I can't stand. I have a very difficult time sitting through them because I see the vast waste of time that these meetings suck up in a life. And I think, okay, there's another 2 hours of my life that I'll never get back, that didn't contribute anything to my sense of who I am. And so I think some people, maybe you're like this, Natalie, that temperamentally you're just drawn to these ideas. It's not something that you can really help. It's just it's part of your constitution.
And I can confidently say that you have just validated so many of my peers' experiences there too, when you say you struggle with small talk and gossip. And I had wondered if that's just because everyone's just coming to the end of this huge doctorate journey, which is exhausting and overwhelming in itself, but perhaps it is part of this.
It might be part of a deeper existential orientation. And you know, again, if a group of friends are sitting around talking about really important life issues, I'm drawn to that like a laser beam. And I will listen and nod my head and contribute where I can. But if the conversation is about politics or sports or redecorating a house or installing a backyard gazebo, or what restaurant is good, or who's coming to town in terms of a band or something, I could care less. My eyes glaze over. I mean, I can play the game and put on the mask of sociability as good as anyone, but when I go home, I'll feel deflated and upset that I lost a few more hours of my life. You see.
And I'm not sure if you noticed it, but I want to reflect back that you said it's those conversations and those meetings which don't contribute to who I am. And that is what is antagonizing and frustrating about them.
Yeah. And that's not to say that I don't willfully do it. And I know it's important work to keep a university going. And I know that we have to put on masks to keep the machinery of society lubricated and well oiled. And it's also not a judgmental thing. I'm not. It may come off like I'm being judgmental. It's who I am. I can't help it. And I think some people love small talk and they love gossip and they love cocktail party conversations. It's just something that I can't bear. It's very difficult for me. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to maintain myself at a 3 or 4 hour long dinner party where the conversation is just idle chatter. I mean, I have to have 2 or 3 glasses of wine just to take the edge off and cope. And that may be revealing more about me than I want to suggest, but it's who I am.
Yeah, I don't think it's judgmental that it came across. I feel like it was very honest, but it makes me realize we don't perhaps often get the opportunity to express in a safe space honestly what does and doesn't work for us in life. We are often involved with situations that are just part of the pattern of existence, and we tolerate them, and we put our masks on, and we navigate them because we feel that we have to. And
I think that's a great point, Natalie. And I think my personal view is that everyone deep down is craving for these conversations, these deep, serious conversations about the meaning of life, but they're scary. They're frightening conversations because they expose so much that we want to keep hidden. But I think all of us, I think it's built into the human condition. We are thirsting for these encounters, these deep, intimate relational encounters, what Martin Buber calls the I-U relation, where we're open and exposed to the other person. And this is what draws people to therapy. This is why people go into therapy, because they want to be heard. They want to have someone listen to them in a way that's sincere and open. And they feel safe in that space, in that therapeutic encounter. And that safety oftentimes isn't there at a social gathering or at a party. But the more intimate that social gathering gets, and the more close-knit that community of friends and relations is, the greater the opportunity for deeper conversations and more penetrating discourse.
And I wonder where it is in life that we do become so scared of confronting these questions, because if you think about children, children are constantly just exploring all of many facets of themselves, all the many potentials of what life has to offer. And they do it with such just innate fearlessness.
Yeah, I think it gets socialized out of us. I think you're right. I think children are always the best philosophers. They're always philosophically inquisitive, and even inquisitive about the deepest and scariest questions about death. You know, what happened to our dog? What happened to grandma? Where do they go after they die? Why? And as young children get socialized in school and in educational institutions, in peer relations, they're kind of told, you don't ask those questions anymore. You do what good boys and girls do, and that's sad. That's unfortunate, and so we lose touch with that wide-eyed openness to the questionability of life that all children have, and it gets beaten out of us. And then there's moments in, I think, late adolescence, early adulthood, when we're woken up again. And that often happens when you go off to when you leave home for the first time, right? Either going to college or go off and practice a trade at 18 or 19, and you leave the home, and suddenly those questions come up again. Who am I? What's the meaning of my life? And then we get our degree and we get our job and we start our career, and we forget those questions until we get our divorce, or we lose our job, or we get a critical illness, and then we're woken up again. And so I think that the experience of questionability that children have comes back to us at different points in our lives. I also think it comes back to us at the end of life, that the older we get, the more humble we get, the more open we get toward mystery and questionability. And I'm actually finishing a book right now on existentialism and aging, and argue that the aging process and the intimacy that aging brings us with grief and loss actually makes us into existentialists. I think the elderly folk tend to be more receptive to these ideas. And there's a lot of interesting evidence to suggest this, that we actually become existentialists the closer we get to death, and the more our future contracts and we realize that we are temporal beings and life is coming to an end.
You've set my mind off in 1,000 different questions, but I need to keep it straight.
Yeah.
and you're speaking about different literature. We've got, you know, we've got theoretical literature, we've got philosophical, perhaps novels, and you've mentioned poetry and film. What about for the person who's sitting there and is like, yeah, these Russian or French and Western philosophers, that they're not my style. Like, there's no way I could engage with those kind of texts. I'm not interested in classical music. I'm not a deep person. I'm not hugely academic or intellectual.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, yeah, some people just aren't readers. Some people aren't intellectually inclined. I think one of the great entryways into existential thinking, if you're not a literary type, is through film. I think there's a lot of really great accessible films that capture the core ideas of existential philosophy, and some of them are blockbusters with some of the great stars in Hollywood. And so what film can do is it can demystify the alienating and intimidating jargon of the existentialists, the German terms and the French terms and the technical language that maybe a Sartre or a Beauvoir or a Heidegger would employ. And I'm thinking of movies like American Beauty, the movie by Sam Mendes, The Tree of Life by Terrence Malick. There's a great Nietzschean themed science fiction film called Arrival that was directed by Villeneuve. Akira Kurosawa, the great Japanese director, of course, has done so many great existential films. The greatest is probably Ikuru, about a man who's diagnosed with terminal cancer, and he's forced to confront a life that has been largely bereft of meaning. And now he's kind of awakened to the urgency of the limited time that he has left. And so I think film is a great way to introduce, and these films are cross-cultural. It's not as if these are just Western filmmakers. I mean, Kurosawa had such a massive impact on Western filmmakers that in many ways he was the pioneer, not Hollywood or French or American filmmakers. And Ingmar Bergman films, of course, anything that Bergman does. Some Woody Allen films are good, although he has demonstrated himself to be a loathsome human being. So that's one way to do it, is through indirectly through film.
And I think that's hugely reassuring, and partly what this project is aspiring to do, because there isn't, for me, an obvious go-to place to say, I've heard this word, this ism, as you were speaking about. It doesn't, it's coming up a lot. It seems that it could be something curious, but I am not able to read these huge tomes. I don't know where to start. I don't know where to go. And it feels that there's not just that kind of stepping stone that opens the door that says, actually, you know, yes, okay, there are so many ways to be highly academic about this and explore it from a highly academic position, and encourage that to be incorporated into different professions and different disciplines. But actually, we don't have to be so formal about it too. We can sit back at the cinema, we can have a conversation with friends, we can just look at ourselves and say, hey, who am I?
And you could show this interview, right? I mean, hopefully we're not using too much highfalutin language. We're talking in a way that I think everyone could understand. And I think even those that are intimidated by the big novels, the Crime and Punishment, the Brothers Karamazov, many of the most powerful and visceral pieces of existential literature are very short stories. The short stories of the Death of Ivan Ilyich is, 50-page story. Camus' The Stranger is a very short story. Dostoevsky has a bunch of short stories that are powerful and accessible. The plays of Jean-Paul Sartre are accessible and pretty easy to follow. And so it's not as if you have to sit down with a 1,000-page piece of Russian literature to absorb the core ideas. You can breeze through, Camus' The Stranger at the beach in an afternoon and be jolted into an awareness of of who we are, and so there's no reason to be scared of it. It's accessible in so many different kinds of ways.
I like how you set the setting there, like you can just read a nice novel on the beach, because you make me realize that there's almost this sense that philosophy must be done in a dark room with a cigar or a brand,
Yeah.
or out in the dark or in the woods or in a classroom. But actually,
I live in Florida. I do most of my work at the beach, right, or outside in the sunshine, and so absolutely, yeah. We don't have to play that stereotype of the serious French intellectual with the beret and the black sweater and smoking a cigarette at the coffee shop, and it can be much more relaxed, and I think it's very accessible.
and I reckon it was at the time for them as well. If half of them were writing at cafes and coffee shops and bars and having these chats and just writing it down, scribbling it down. And I believe to an
And
extent,
it wasn't exactly. I mean, in the golden age in the 1940s and 50s in France, it was everywhere. I mean, existentialism was in the air, and it was in the coffee shops, in the cafe society, on the sidewalks. But it was also in the air in the United States, in that it was a big driver of the counterculture revolution. And Camus and Sartre and Beauvoir were such important political voices, and in speaking to the Vietnam War, to the civil rights movement, to the women's movement. It was an important part of the New Left in Great Britain, and so it was in the air. It wasn't isolated in academic settings. It wasn't there in seminar halls. It was out in the streets is where existentialism had its high point, and it'd be wonderful to see that come back in some ways. And there are some glimmers of hope that that's the case. I mean, there's aspects of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, the Me Too movement, the Greta Thunberg's climate strike movement, that have real resonances to existential philosophy in terms of conveying the urgency of our situation. And so my sense is that existentialism is coming back. It's coming back and being received in ways that it hasn't in the past.
coming back from textbooks and academia into kind of common dialogue and discourse. And
yeah, and also I think coming back from a complacency in the face of neoliberal politics and crass materialism. I think that there's nothing like the recognition that the planet may be uninhabitable in 40 years to jolt us into an awakening. And I see this a lot with my students. I'm 51 years old, so the urgency of the climate change isn't going to hit me as viscerally. But for my 20-year-old students, they may be living in a planet that is radically different than the one that I'm living in when they're my age. And so when we talk about nihilism or the death of God and the search for meaning, the climate change crisis can jolt us into an awareness of those kinds of questions.
And you're bringing us here nicely back into this discussion that existentialism isn't just theoretical. It's not just within our mind, but it's within our embodied world as well. It's in the physical world as well. And
yeah.
What this leads back into is what you were sharing about your own specialities, for one of
yeah, absolutely. And my own life. I mean, it's shaped me in deep ways in my own life. It's pulled me through profound catastrophic events in my life, near-death events. And if anything, my relationship to this kind of philosophy is more intimate and profound than it's ever been. And it's very much different from the place that I was when I was an 18 or 20-year-old philosopher enamored by Nietzsche and the radical ideas, because I hadn't lived them. I hadn't lived these ideas. I hadn't experienced them in the visceral way that 30 years of life experience teaches you. And so the wisdom of these thinkers has become even more pronounced as I've gotten older. And I don't think that's going to change much. I think it's going to become more pronounced as I move into my 60s and 70s. If I get there, if I make it to tomorrow, you see?
It does feel like an endless, absolutely endless journey, the discovery and exploration of the existential field. I was going to say I don't know if I love it or I hate it, but I think it's definitely that I love it. And it's just, any person that you speak to has the potential, and quite often does, add a whole nother, open door after door after door, and you look through and you think, wow, there's so much more.
And I think even the language of love and hate, as you know, is a little bit misleading. It's not that you love it or hate it, it's that it matters to you. It matters to you deeply. And so those simple binaries of good and evil or love and hate, it doesn't capture the ambiguity of what this field discloses. And all that you can say with sincerity is that this material means something to me in a deep way, even if articulating that meaning is always going to be inchoate and unclear.
To the point that people like ourselves are just so inspired that we dedicate a significant amount of our life to trying to share that, or at least invite, or as I would say, we're offering other people the opportunity to explore these ideas.
And I really like, Natalie, this idea of existential offering. I think there's such a wonderful openness about that phrase. What can I offer you, and how can I open you up to the relevance and significance of these ideas? I think that's a really neat part of the project.
Thank you. I thought of that when I was sitting during my training, and I was just being exposed to all of these different ideas, and I was trying to establish which one I'm supposed to resonate with, which particular theory, and how I'm supposed to take it all on board. And it suddenly dawned on me that that's not, at least for me, that's not what existential philosophies are about. They're so magnificently vast and complex, and they will have completely different meanings to each person in each moment, depending on where they're situated. And each one offer an opportunity and offer a different angle, and it's up to us whether we take it or leave it or put it aside for later.
I agree.
On that note, how would you describe your existential offering, as it were?
I guess my existential offering would, in the bluntest possible way, recognize that this life is not a dress rehearsal. This is the only life you have. This day is the only day that exists right now. And remind yourself, or be vigilant to the idea that this existence is precarious, and it's unstable, and it's uncertain, and that you can't take things for granted. You can't take these relationships for granted. You can't take the beauty of a sunset or a rainy afternoon for granted, a good meal for granted, or a good cup of coffee. Treasure those moments, because they can be snatched away from you at any time. And I think recognizing that life is not a dress rehearsal will bring a measure of intensity and urgency to aspects of our life that we all too often take for granted.
And why is that intensity and urgency so important?
Well, because it reminds us of how beautiful and precious this life is, and mysterious and gracious this life is. And if you're happy with an existence where you're just pulled along by the shallows of everyday life, so much the better for you. But my sense is that most of us don't want to live that way. We want to live with a sense that this is a life worth living, that this is a life that can have deep meaning if we so choose. Regardless of the career path that we take, it can be embodied in our relationships, in the care that we have for our sick and dying parents, the way that we love and take care of our children, or the environment or the natural world. And so my sense is without that measure of intensity and urgency, it's not as much of a life worth living, unfortunately.
I pick up on how you're saying, I sense, I sense, I sense. And is this what you were referring to in your work earlier when you were saying that we're embodied beings as well, we're phenomenological beings as well, we're not just these.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the great insights of the existentialists is that the human condition is disclosed to us not through theoretical reflection, it's disclosed to us through feelings, through moods, through affective experience. And we the argument or the suggestion is that we feel when we're inauthentic, and that feeling is knowledge. We know when we're not being true to ourselves. We know when we're wearing masks and being self-deceptive. How do we know? It feels a certain way, you see, and feeling authenticity also feels a certain way. We feel a particular kind of mood that's atmospheric, and it colors our entire life.
You see, it's making me think of how many times we can have this feeling, and one that we're not finding pleasant, and one that we're wanting to change and we're finding it uncomfortable but we're living with it. We can do that for hours or weeks or months or years. We can live with this sense that our life is not being lived and experienced in the way that perhaps it should be, but yet we're not changing it, and that is that embodied sense of discomfort.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, you know, one of the underlying themes, I think, in almost all existential philosophy is courage. That you have to have the courage or steadiness to be true to who you are, and whenever you feel yourself get sucked back into a life of self-deception, which is always going to happen, it's inevitable. It's structural to the human condition, inauthenticity. To have the courage to question that temptation, to challenge it, to remind yourself what is at stake in life, to remind yourself that this is a day that you may not get, that the future is an illusion. You don't get it tomorrow. Tomorrow's not guaranteed. And so why are you going to go to that cocktail party? Why are you going to join that committee? Why are you going to waste that time in a conversation that's going to have no bearing on your existence? Are there better ways to live, better ways to spend the very limited time that you have on Earth?
How, in those situations, do you have the courage to keep going?
It's a good question. I remind myself every day. I try to remind myself with a mantra every day. Life is short. Life is short. Be grateful. Life is short. Be grateful. I'll say that actually in my car when I'm driving to work, and when I'm walking onto campus, I'll remind myself, be grateful this day. This is the only day. And it's hard. Sometimes, you know, you get sucked into the things, sucked into everydayness, and you lose touch with that. But I try to develop a kind of practice. This is what Aristotle calls phronesis. It's a practical wisdom that becomes habit. It becomes part of who you are, so that you don't have to try anymore to be grateful. You don't have to try anymore to be aware of your own temporality or your own finitude. It just becomes who you are. And so you see the sunsets in Florida differently. You see the blue sky in a different way. You see the trees on campus in a different way. And that's practical wisdom.
And I hugely appreciate your honesty with that question, because I think confronting truth, confronting life, confronting existence can be exhausting and overwhelming, and there are moments that we don't just innately have that courage flaring up within us to keep going and to keep exploring. But what you're sharing here is that this is not just a passive process. This is an active engagement.
That's right. And that's, again, a central theme in existentialist philosophy. I mean, Sartre and Beauvoir actually call it engaged literature, that the writing has to be engaged with the concrete realities of existence. And we have to bring that engagement into our own lives so that it's not just something that we scribble down on a page, it's something that we embody in our everyday lives. And it's hard work. It's very difficult because self-deception is very easy. It's easy to be inauthentic, and it's nice. It's comforting and tranquilizing, as Heidegger says.
And also that we go through that phase where it was respectful to tranquilize ourselves. It was respectful to switch off our questioning brain and to queue up in the playground and sit down in the classroom and study something that isn't connecting with you. We're trained to do that, and you're told off if you're not, and you're being respectful if you do, and then suddenly it all changes again. And
yeah, I agree.
But thank you so much for sharing today, Kevin. I'm wondering, was there...
My pleasure, Natalie. It was a real pleasure to have this conversation, and I hope that whoever sees it appreciates it as well. And it was really fun for me to have this talk, and hopefully our paths will cross sometime in real life in the future.
I'm sure we'll make that happen, and I'm sure it will inspire. I hope so too. Thank you so much, Kevin.
It's my pleasure. Okay, we'll talk soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.